My husband's keynote speech in Florida was a lie. He wasn't accepting an award for innovative ad design. He was staying in Suite 1204 of the Grand Hibiscus Hotel with a woman who was not me. I know this because my best friend Carol was in Suite 1208, and she sent me a photograph that sliced my 15-year marriage in half with a single click. The first thing I did wasn't cry. I opened the file on my laptop, where I keep our financial records, and I started a new spreadsheet. He thought the game was about passion. I was about to teach him it was about assets. Before I tell you what I did next, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Our life, until that Tuesday afternoon, had been a carefully constructed masterpiece of suburban comfort. I'm Sarah, 42, and for 15 years, I'd been the silent partner in my husband Mark's meteoric rise at Ello Banana. He was the brilliant creative director, the charismatic mind who could sell ice to a polar bear. I was the one who managed the logistics of his brilliance, our portfolio, our home, our future. I balanced the books. I planned the investments. I made sure the foundation of our life was solid granite, so he could build his castles in the sky. We were a team, or so I thought, a perfectly balanced equation of ambition and stability. But equations only work when all the variables are honest, and one of his had been alive for a very long time. My phone buzzed with a call from a number I knew was lounging by a pool in Miami. It was Carol, my college roommate, a woman with a private investigator's eye for detail and a fierce loyalty that had never wavered in 20 years. Her voice was low, conspiratorial. "Sarah, don't panic," she started, which is a guaranteed way to make someone panic. "I'm at the Grand Hibiscus. I just saw Mark in the hallway." My heart did a slow, painful lurch. "That's great," I managed, my voice sounding thin. "Did you say hi?" There was a pause. "He was with someone," she said carefully. "The woman from his office Christmas party. The tall one with the red hair? They went into a room together, Sarah. Suite 1204. I felt the blood drain from my face as she sent me the photo. The picture was blurry, taken from down a long, ornate hotel hallway, but it was undeniably them. Mark, with his hand on the small of her back, guiding her into the room. Her head was tilted toward his, a cascade of fiery red hair obscuring her face, but I knew who she was. Chloe, the ambitious new copywriter he couldn't stop praising, the one with a fresh perspective and a killer instinct. I dismissed my unease as professional jealousy on his behalf. How naive I had been. It wasn't the sight of them together that shattered me. People make mistakes, passions flare and fade. It was the casual intimacy, the practiced ease of their movements. This wasn't a first-time fumble in the dark. This was a well-rehearsed routine, and I had been funding the production. A strange calm washed over me, cold and absolute, the kind of clarity that comes after a high fever breaks. I looked around my living room, at the custom-built bookshelves I'd designed, the original artwork we'd collected, the life I thought was ours. It all felt like a stage set, and I was the only person who hadn't been given a script. My husband wasn't just on a business trip. He was on a vacation from our marriage, using our shared resources. The man I had married was a stranger, and I was living in his house. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, it was logistical, it was a fraud woven into the very fabric of our existence. He had used the assets I managed to build a second life I knew nothing about. Just then, my phone rang again. It was Mark. His voice was warm, tinged with the manufactured exhaustion of a man who'd just given the speech of his life. "Hey babe, it went great. They loved the campaign concept. Wish you were here." I could hear the faint sound of music in the background, the clink of glasses. Networking, he would call it. I took a deep breath, picturing the hotel hallway, the red hair, the hand on her back. "I'm so proud of you," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "Tell me everything." He launched into a detailed, vibrant lie, full of names I didn't know and successes that were pure fiction. He was a masterful storyteller. I had to give him that. And in that moment, I knew I had to become a better strategist than he was. As he spoke, a thought clicked into place, a detail so small I'd almost missed it. He mentioned the Ad Age Innovator of the Year award he was there to receive. I had helped him prep for this trip, booked his flights, packed his suitcase. But I had never seen an official invitation or confirmation for that specific award. On a hunch, I minimized the photo from Carol and typed the name of the award into a search engine. The results came back instantly. The Ad Age Innovator of the Year ceremony wasn't in Florida in the spring. It was in New York in the fall. The trip, the speech, the award, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed alibi for an affair. The moment I hung up the phone, the cold calm in my veins sharpened into something harder, something with an edge. He hadn't just lied about who he was with, he had lied about the entire purpose of his professional life, the very career I had worked so hard to support from the shadows. I walked into his home office, a room I had organized down to the last paperclip. I opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one marked accolades. It was full of certificates and plaques. I sifted through them until I found it. A small, cheap-looking plaque from a local design competition 3 years ago. It was the only award he had ever won. The rest of this persona, the industry titan, the keynote speaker, it was a house of cards.
He thought his greatest secret was the woman in suite 1204. He was wrong. His greatest secret was his own profound mediocrity, a carefully hidden insecurity I had unknowingly enabled for years. He had built his entire identity on my support, and I was about to pull out the foundations one by one. The affair was just a symptom. The disease was the fraud, and I knew with chilling certainty exactly how to cure it. Mark believed his greatest skill was creativity, the art of the big idea. He was wrong. His true genius was in delegation, not just of work, but of truth. He'd outsourced his integrity years ago, and I, his loving wife, had been unknowingly managing the payroll. As I sat in his silent office, the glow of the monitor painting shadows on the wall, I wasn't just a wife who'd been cheated on. I was an auditor who had just discovered a catastrophic level of fraud. The infidelity was a rounding error. The real crime was the phantom empire he'd built using my trust as collateral. And I was about to foreclose on the entire operation. The first step in any demolition is to study the blueprints. Mark's professional life, I now realized, was a carefully constructed facade. His LinkedIn profile was a monument to his ego, listing skills he didn't possess and projects he'd barely touched. He was connected to every industry bigwig in the city, men and women I'd entertained in my home, whose names he dropped at dinner parties like confetti. He had always claimed his network was his greatest asset. I suspected it was his greatest liability, a network of loosely connected nodes, none of whom likely knew the full picture. The question was, how deep did the deception go? I started with the Kensington Project, a campaign that had supposedly won him a promotion 2 years ago. He'd told me he'd pulled it from the fire, working 80-hour weeks to salvage a failing account. My role had been to keep the home front running, to make sure he had hot meals and clean shirts while he fought his corporate battles. I logged into our shared cloud drive, a digital attic of our lives, and navigated to a folder I hadn't opened in years, archived pitches. There, buried under layers of forgotten work, I found the original Kensington files. The metadata told a story Mark had never shared. The core concept, the winning slogan, even the graphic design templates, they weren't his. They were time-stamped with the credentials of a junior designer named Alex Smith, a quiet, brilliant kid Mark had supposedly mentored. Mark's only contribution was adding his name to the final presentation file, 48 hours after Alex had saved the last draft. He hadn't salvaged a failing project, he'd hijacked a successful one. My blood ran cold as the pattern began to emerge. I cross-referenced 3 other major campaigns he'd claimed as his own. In each case, the foundational work belonged to someone else, a freelancer, a junior associate, an intern. He was a vulture, circling until the real work was done, then swooping in to claim the kill.
His charisma was the anesthetic. No one seemed to notice the theft until he was already on stage, accepting the applause. He didn't just steal ideas, he stole futures, promotions, and the credit that rightfully belonged to young, hungry creatives who were too intimidated to speak up. How many careers had he suppressed to build his own? The emotional betrayal of the affair felt almost quaint now. A simple black and white photograph next to this sprawling full-color mural of deceit. This was not a man who had a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a man whose entire professional identity was a carefully curated lie. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was cheating the world, his colleagues, and the very industry he purported to love. He had insulated himself with a reputation I had helped him build, hosting dinner parties for his bosses and schmoozing with clients. I had been his unwitting accomplice, the respectable, intelligent wife who made his fraudulent life seem plausible. The thought was nauseating. Then I found the connection that made the entire scheme click into place. The master key to his locked box of secrets. I was digging through the project files for the new Odyssey Automotive campaign, the one he was supposedly in Florida celebrating. The preliminary research folder was vast, but one subfolder stood out. Concept Drafts CV. CV, Chloe Vance, the copywriter. Inside was a series of brilliant, insightful documents outlining the entire campaign strategy, from the target demographic to the final tagline. The work was exceptional. It was also dated 6 weeks before Mark ever presented the idea to his team as his own. He hadn't just taken Chloe to Florida, he had taken her work and was likely using the trip as her reward. A private celebration for a victory she couldn't claim publicly. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He had woven his affair and his professional fraud into a single, seamless tapestry of lies. Chloe wasn't just his mistress, she was a willing participant in his professional misconduct, trading her talent for a room at the Grand Hibiscus and the attention of a man in a position of power. They were partners in crime, and they were using my money to fund their getaway. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. They thought they were insulated by their shared secret. They had no idea that their conspiracy was my leverage. He had given her a hotel suite, but I was about to give her something far more memorable, a front row seat to his complete and utter implosion. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet, manicured street. Our neighbors were bringing in their garbage cans, their lives orderly and predictable. My own life had been a lie, but the path forward was becoming brutally clear.
Mark and Chloe had made a critical error. They had underestimated the person who signed the checks and audited the receipts. They thought I was just the wife. They were about to learn I was the one who owned the building they were playing in, and eviction notices were being prepared. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady as I scrolled through my contacts. It was time to make my first call. Not to a lawyer, but to the one person who knew more about Mark's professional vulnerabilities than I did. It was time to talk to Alex Smith. Alex, this is Sarah, Mark's wife. The silence on the other end of the line was not one of confusion. It was the dead, heavy silence of a cornered animal, the kind of quiet that speaks volumes about the man who had inspired it. I let the silence hang in the air, a weapon in its own right.
He was likely expecting a call from his boss, perhaps with some trivial weekend request. He was not expecting a call from his boss's wife, and I knew in that instant that Mark had made every single one of his subordinates afraid of the very people they should have been able to trust. This fear was a resource I could now use. I pictured him in his small downtown apartment, the one Mark had once described with a dismissive wave as perfect for a kid starting out. I imagined him surrounded by monitors and sketchpads, the tools of a brilliant talent he wasn't yet allowed to fully claim as his own. I didn't use a sympathetic voice. That would have been a mistake, a signal of emotional weakness. I used the calm, measured tone of a project manager reviewing a discrepancy. "I'm going through the digital archives for the Kensington project," I said, keeping my voice level. "The metadata on the final presentation deck is interesting. It seems to have your digital signature all over the foundational work." He stammered, the practiced corporate politeness warring with raw panic. I collaborated with Mark on that. It was a team effort." I decided to cut through the pretense not with aggression, but with a shared truth. "Alex, collaboration leaves a different digital footprint. This footprint looks like you built a house, and he simply signed the deed. I'm not calling from the agency. I'm calling as someone who has a vested and very personal interest in the accuracy of those records." He was still hesitant, the fear of professional suicide warring with his conscience. I gave him the final piece of leverage he needed to trust me. And for the record, I know he's in Florida right now for a conference that doesn't actually exist.
That's what it took. The confirmation that I knew the current lie, not just the old ones. The story of the Kensington project spilled out of him, followed by 2 others, each a new layer of the same rotten onion. He told me about the unspoken Mark tax, the price young creatives paid for the privilege of working under a supposed genius. They got a big-name agency on their resume, and in return, Mark skimmed the cream off their best and most innovative ideas, presenting them as his own flashes of brilliance. He painted a damning portrait of a man who cultivated a culture of fear, disguised as mentorship, a predator who knew exactly which members of the herd were too hungry, too inexperienced, or too financially insecure to fight back. He wasn't just stealing their work, he was stealing their confidence. As he spoke, my own anger solidified into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my own dignity anymore. I was fighting for every kid like Alex, every young talent who had been taught that their best was not their own. "Do you still have the original files?" I asked, guiding him toward the next logical step. "The early drafts. The email chains where he gave you feedback that was nothing more than a request for the final, polished version." I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. He was a meticulous designer, a digital native. Of course he had them. He likely had a private server, a secret digital vault where he kept his real portfolio, a testament to the work he'd done but could never claim. That vault was the arsenal I needed. Then he went quiet for a moment, and what he said next added a twisted new dimension to the entire affair. "He did the same thing to Chloe at first," Alex said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "On the Odyssey pitch. He took her initial concept deck, presented it as his own framework, and then she just seemed to lean into it. It was like she watched what happened to the rest of us and decided it was better to be the co-pilot in his private jet than the lead designer of her own small propeller plane. So Chloe wasn't just a simple homewrecker. She was a victim who had chosen to become an accomplice, a graduate of Mark's school of casual corruption. Her weakness wasn't just lust. It was a desperate, corrosive ambition. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about exposing an affair or a professional fraud. It was about dismantling a corrupt system that Mark had built, a system that rewarded complicity and punished integrity. "I want you to gather everything you have, Alex," I said, my tone shifting from inquisitive to directive. "Not just on Kensington.
everything, for every project you've seen him compromise. Create a secure shared folder. I want a complete, time-stamped record of Mark's creative process. He didn't hesitate. His voice, once trembling with fear, was now filled with a quiet, righteous fury. "I'll have it for you by morning," he said.
As I hung up the phone, the second phase of my plan began to materialize. Alex was my inside man, the archivist of Mark's professional sins. But a library of evidence is useless without the right readers. Mark's real power, his true currency, wasn't his title at the agency. It was his reputation in the city. It was cultivated at the country club, at the charity galas, among the very industry bigwigs I had hosted for dinner so many times. He thought that network was his shield. I was about to prove it was nothing more than a gallery, and I was preparing for a private showing. The Glenview Country Club was a masterclass in polite fiction, a place where fortunes were won and lost over a game of golf, and reputations were dismantled with a single, well-placed whisper over brunch. Mark had always seen it as his natural habitat, a stage for his carefully crafted persona. He had no idea that I saw it for what it truly was, an echo chamber. And on a crisp, sunlit Thursday morning, I was there to introduce a new sound, a single discordant note that I knew would soon crescendo into a symphony of his social ruin. I wasn't there for the mimosas. I was there to have a quiet word with Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was the unofficial queen of Glenview, a woman whose husband Robert ran a rival advertising firm. Her influence wasn't derived from a title, but from her position at the center of the city's most potent information network, gossip. She was a curator of secrets, and a stamp of her disapproval could quietly blackball a person from every important guest list and boardroom in town. Mark had worked for years to earn her favor, believing her friendship was a validation of his status. He thought she was an ally. I knew she was an opportunist with a deep-seated professional jealousy of Mark, masked by a veneer of social grace. She was the perfect, fertile ground in which to plant the first seed of doubt. I found her on the terrace, feigning surprise as she held court with two other women from our social circle. "Sarah, darling, I thought you'd be in Florida with your brilliant husband," she exclaimed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I heard he's the toast of the town down there." Her words were a test, a casual probe for information. I smiled back, a picture of wifely pride mixed with just the right amount of concern. "He is," I said, letting out a small, troubled sigh. "But that's actually what I wanted to ask your advice about. You and Robert are so good at navigating the politics of the industry. I'm a little worried about Mark." The other women leaned in, their interest piqued. This was far better than discussing catering for the spring gala. I had their undivided attention. "It's his generosity," I began, my voice filled with manufactured worry. "He's such a dedicated mentor to the young talent at his agency. He pours so much of his energy into cultivating their ideas. Sometimes I think he forgets to save any of that brilliance for himself." I paused, letting the implication hang in the air. I wasn't accusing him of theft. I was praising his selflessness to the point of absurdity. I was reframing his crime as a character flaw his wife was concerned about. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. She smelled blood in the water. "What do you mean, darling?" she asked, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Well," I said, looking down at my hands as if I were sharing a painful secret, "there's this one prodigy, an incredibly gifted designer named Alex Smith. Mark has taken him under his wing, and the boy's work is just transformative. But then the final campaigns come out, and all I see is Mark's name on them. I worry people might get the wrong impression, that they might not see how much Mark is giving to these young people." I let the word giving land with a heavy, ironic thud.
I had just handed Eleanor a weapon, gift-wrapped in concern. She took the bait. "And it's not just Alex," I continued, my voice dropping conspiratorially. "There's a new copywriter, a very ambitious young woman named Chloe Vance. Mark has been spending an enormous amount of time with her, convinced she's the next big thing. He even took her to the Florida conference to immerse her in the industry." I looked directly at Eleanor, my eyes wide with feigned innocence. "I just hope his dedication isn't misinterpreted. You know how people talk. A man in his position with a young, attractive protege, it's a dangerous narrative." I hadn't mentioned an affair. I didn't need to. I had just painted a picture of professional impropriety and layered it with the insinuation of a personal one. A slow, predatory smile crept across Eleanor's face. The concern in her eyes was replaced by a gleam, the unmistakable thrill of possessing information that could alter the social landscape. She wasn't my friend offering sympathy. She was a chess player who had just been handed a move that would put her rival in checkmate. She placed her hand on mine, her touch cool and firm. "Sarah, you were right to be concerned, and you were right to come to me. Robert has mentioned some inconsistencies in the stories coming out of Mark's agency. This clarifies things." It was a lie, of course. Robert had mentioned no such thing, but Eleanor was already weaving my story into a larger, more damning narrative of her own making. She patted my hand. "Don't you worry about a thing. A man who takes advantage of his position, both professionally and otherwise, needs to be understood for who he really is. I'll make a few discreet inquiries. People should know what kind of mentor Mark is." The word mentor was now laced with her own delicious venom. I had done it. I had successfully outsourced the first phase of the demolition. I hadn't spread a single rumor myself. I had simply shared my wifely concerns with the most effective broadcaster in the city. As I walked away from the terrace, leaving Eleanor to her plotting, I felt a chilling sense of satisfaction. The phone call I was now waiting for wasn't from my husband. It was for the first report of the fallout, the first tremor of the earthquake I had just triggered.
The email arrived at 2:17 a.m., a single, sterile notification in the dead of night. The subject line was simply, "The Archives." It was from Alex. He hadn't just sent files, he had delivered a weapon. A fully assembled, high-caliber instrument of Mark's undoing. Clicking open the secure link felt less like an act of marital espionage and more like unsealing a tomb. I wasn't just looking at evidence of professional misconduct, I was about to perform a digital autopsy on a career that had been dead for years, propped up only by my financial support and the stolen talent of others. The folder was a masterpiece of righteous fury, a meticulously curated museum of his deceptions. Alex had organized everything by campaign, each one a separate exhibit in the gallery of Mark's fraud. There were original concept sketches with non-Mark initials, email chains showing a junior designer sending a final version, only to have Mark reply with the terse, "I'll handle the presentation from here," and screen recordings of file histories that showed his name being added to a project only in the final closing minutes. It was a stunning, undeniable timeline of his parasitic creative process. He was a ghost in the machine, a phantom who only appeared at the very end to claim the credit for the haunting. Each file was a new stab of betrayal, but not for the reasons he would think. I scrolled through the names of the young designers, copywriters, and strategists whose work was on display. I recognized some of them. I'd served them wine in my home, asked about their careers, and listened as Mark condescendingly referred to them as his talented but green team.
I had smiled and nodded, believing I was the supportive wife of a brilliant mentor. The truth was grotesque. I had been the one pouring the wine for the executioner, hosting the very people whose professional futures my husband was actively suppressing. The Mark tax wasn't just a skimming of ideas, it was a systematic dismantling of their confidence, and I had been an unwitting accomplice to every transaction. The most damning exhibit was the one labeled Odyssey Automotive, CV. It contained the entire 6-week email correspondence between Mark and Chloe. It began with him praising her raw talent and ended with her sending a complete, polished campaign strategy with the subject line, "Final draft, for you." His reply, sent just 3 minutes later, was a single sentence. "Excellent. This is exactly what I needed to get started." He hadn't even pretended to collaborate. He had solicited her genius, and she had handed it over, a willing sacrifice at the altar of his ego. I wondered what he had promised her in return. A promotion? A partnership? Or was a week in a Florida hotel suite all her ambition was worth? A sudden, practical thought cut through my anger, a detail rooted in the 15 years I'd spent managing our finances. His trip. The expenses. He was a creature of habit and arrogance, and he would never pass up an opportunity to bill his indiscretions to the company.
I logged into Elo Banana's corporate expense portal using the password I'd set for him years ago, Legacy 1985. The irony was sickening. His pending expense report for the Florida conference was already there, a digital breadcrumb trail of his lies. The details were so brazen, so utterly contemptuous of me and his employer that I almost laughed. There was the charge for Suite 1204, of course, listed as a necessary upgrade for client meetings. But there was more. A client dinner for 2 at Miami's most expensive steakhouse for over $600. A receipt from a high-end jewelry store in the hotel lobby categorized under promotional gifting. 2 tickets to a concert labeled as industry networking event. And the final, most insulting entry, a charge from the hotel spa for a couples massage, with the memo line simply reading, "Stress reduction, pre-keynote." He wasn't just having an affair. He was submitting a fully itemized invoice for it, and he expected his company, and by extension me, to foot the bill. I didn't feel rage. I felt gratitude. He was so consumed by his own arrogance that he was documenting his own downfall, providing me with receipts for his moral and financial bankruptcy. I methodically took screenshots of every single line item, downloading the fraudulent receipts and saving them to a new folder on my desktop. I now had 2 distinct and equally devastating dossiers. The first, from Alex, proved he was a professional fraud. The second, from his own expense report, proved he was a common thief. The affair was almost irrelevant now, a sordid little footnote in a much larger story of corruption. He hadn't just broken our vows, he had broken the law. I now had the what. The next question was the who. A man like Mark wasn't afraid of lawyers. He saw them as players in a game he could win. He wasn't afraid of his wife. He saw me as a resource to be managed. But there was one person he was truly afraid of, the one person whose opinion was the source of all his power and prestige at the agency. My target wasn't the board of directors or the HR department. It was one man, David Sterling, the agency's founder and CEO, a man who had built his empire on a reputation for integrity, a reputation my husband was currently torching in a Florida hotel room, and I was about to send him the bill. I hadn't requested a meeting about my husband. That would have been dismissed as a domestic dispute, a messy, emotional affair to be handled by HR. I had secured the meeting under a different, far more compelling pretext. My email to his assistant had been brief and professional, referencing my 15 years of managing the Flores Sterling private portfolio, a collection of joint investments David and I had made over the years. I was, on paper, a trusted financial partner. I was coming to him not as a scorned wife, but as a concerned stakeholder, and that was a language he could not ignore. He greeted me with a warm, paternal smile, the kind he reserved for people he considered part of his inner circle. "Sarah, it's always a pleasure. I hope this isn't about that tech fund. My broker tells me it's about to rebound." He was relaxed, unsuspecting. I smiled back, a picture of calm deliberation. "No, David, the portfolio is fine. I'm here about a different kind of liability, one that I believe poses a significant and immediate threat to the Elo Banana brand." His smile tightened. The word liability had his full and undivided attention. I didn't present him with Alex's files or the expense reports. Not yet. That was the evidence for the trial. This was the opening statement, designed to dismantle Mark's character before a single piece of paper was presented. "As you know," I began, my voice steady, "I've been the primary manager of Mark's professional life behind the scenes for his entire career here. I've always admired the way you fostered a culture of mentorship at the agency." I let the compliment land, a soft prelude to the coming blow. "But I've become increasingly concerned that Mark's passion for mentoring has created a vulnerability. He gives so much of himself to the young creatives, so much of his time and his creative energy, that the lines of contribution have become blurred." I was using the same narrative I'd given Eleanor Vance, but this time it wasn't for gossip. It was for a corporate execution. David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He was a shrewd man who had seen every trick in the book. He knew this wasn't just a wife's concern. "Blurred in what way, Sarah?" he asked, his voice losing his warmth. "In a way," I said, choosing my words with surgical precision, "that could lead a talented but impressionable young person to believe that their work is, in fact, Mark's. In a way that could lead an ambitious employee to believe that their personal and professional loyalty to Mark entitles them to certain rewards that are funded by the company but are not in the company's best interest." I was speaking in the sterile, coded language of corporate liability, but the message was crystal clear. "Are you referring to anyone in particular?" "I'm referring to a pattern of behavior, most recently exemplified by his trip to Florida. He's there with a junior copywriter, Chloe Vance, for a conference that our corporate travel agent can find no record of, expensing items that have no conceivable business purpose."
Simultaneously, the campaign that this trip is allegedly celebrating, the Odyssey Automotive pitch, appears to be almost entirely the work of Miss Vance herself, according to the project's digital history. I paused, letting the two facts connect in his mind. Professional fraud and financial theft, inextricably linked. He sat back in his chair, his face a mask of stone. I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He wasn't thinking about Mark's marriage or Chloe's career. He was thinking about the Odyssey Automotive account, one of the largest in the agency's portfolio. He was thinking about the potential for a lawsuit, the public relations nightmare, the catastrophic damage to the Elo Banana name. Mark was no longer his star creative director. He was a walking, talking brand crisis. "Do you have documentation to support these concerns?" he asked, the word concerns now heavy with impending doom. "I have a complete, time-stamped archive of the creative work in question, and I have screenshots of the fraudulent expense reports submitted just last night," I said calmly, "but I didn't bring them with me today. I came to you first, David, out of respect for our long-standing relationship. I believe you should have the opportunity to handle this internally before it becomes an external problem.
It was a threat, elegantly phrased as a courtesy. I had given him a choice. He could either be the man who cleans his own house, or he could be the man whose house is condemned by the city. There was only one choice a man like David Sterling could ever make. He stared at me for a long, silent moment, the paternal warmth completely gone, replaced by the cold, hard gaze of a CEO facing a mortal threat. He said, his voice a low growl, "Send me everything you have, and not a word of this to anyone else. I will handle this." As I stood to leave, he looked at me, a flicker of something. Was it pity or respect in his eyes? "You've been managing a very difficult asset, Sarah." I met his gaze without flinching. "Yes," I said, "and as you know, my policy is to divest from any asset that is no longer profitable." I walked out of his office, leaving the door open just a crack, the scent of fear and impending corporate carnage trailing behind me. The fuse had been lit. All I had to do now was wait for the explosion. Mark's return from Florida was not the triumphant arrival of a conquering hero, but the quiet, unsuspecting entry of a man walking into his own ambush. He arrived on Sunday evening, tanned and self-satisfied, bearing a ridiculously oversized bottle of duty-free perfume for me and a collection of vibrant, well-rehearsed lies about his keynote success. He thought he was walking into our comfortable home, back to the arms of his devoted, unsuspecting wife. He had no idea he was stepping onto a meticulously prepared stage, and the final act of our marriage was about to begin. The house was not filled with the aroma of a welcome home dinner. It was filled with a chilling, clinical silence.
He found me in the living room, a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. I wasn't pacing or crying. I was sitting calmly in an armchair, a thin manila folder resting on the table beside me. He dropped his suitcase, his smile faltering slightly at the coldness of the room. "Hey, babe, you wouldn't believe the week I've had. The industry is buzzing about the Odyssey campaign." He moved to kiss me, but I didn't stand. I simply looked at him, my expression unreadable. The disconnect between his reality and mine was a chasm about to swallow him whole. "I'm sure it is," I said, my voice devoid of warmth. "I'm sure Chloe Vance's work is very impressive." The name dropped into the silence like a stone, and the manufactured bonhomie vanished from his face, replaced with a flicker of pure animal panic. He straightened up, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "Chloe? What does she have to do with anything? She's a junior on the team, that's all." The lie was so reflexive, so practiced, that it was almost pitiful. He was still playing a game he had already lost. "Don't," I said, my voice cutting through his denial like a razor. "Just don't. I'm not in the mood for your creative process tonight, Mark." I picked up the folder from the table. It didn't contain Alex's files or the expense reports. That was for the boardroom. This was for the living room. This was personal. I slid a single photograph across the coffee table toward him. It was a crystal-clear, high-resolution printout of the picture Carol had sent me from the hotel hallway. Him, with his hand on the small of Chloe's back, guiding her into suite 1204. His face went white. The final, flimsy wall of his denial crumbled to dust. He sank onto the sofa opposite me, his head in his hands. The performance was over. "Sarah, I can explain," he stammered, the words hollow and meaningless. "It's not what it looks like." I almost left. The arrogance was breathtaking. Even now, caught red-handed, his instinct was not to confess, but to manage the narrative. "Isn't it?" I asked calmly. "It looks like my husband took his mistress on a vacation to Florida, billed it to his company, and lied to my face about winning an award that doesn't exist. Is there a nuance I'm missing?" He looked up, his eyes pleading. This was a new role for him, the penitent husband. He was, I had to admit, a versatile actor.
It was a mistake, a stupid, meaningless mistake. It meant nothing, Sarah. You and I, what we have, that's real." He was trying to appeal to our shared history, to the 15 years I had invested in our life together. He was trying to frame this as a simple, forgivable infidelity. He still didn't understand. The affair was the symptom, not the disease. "What we have, Mark," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel, "is a portfolio of assets, and I have discovered that you have been grossly mismanaging them."
That was the line that finally broke through his emotional script. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time all evening, and the fear in his eyes was replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. This wasn't about jealousy or heartbreak. This was a hostile takeover. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "I'm talking about the fact that your entire career is a fiction I can no longer afford to underwrite," I said, standing up. "I'm talking about the Kensington Project and the Sterling Automotive pitch and the Odyssey campaign. I'm talking about Alex Smith and a dozen other young creatives whose futures you've used to wallpaper over your own mediocrity." He stared at me, speechless. He had believed his professional life and his personal life were two separate theaters. He had no idea I held the master key to both. "So, while you were reducing stress with Chloe at the hotel spa," I continued, "I was having a very productive conversation with David Sterling. I've provided him with a comprehensive audit of your contributions to the agency. I also gave him your itemized expense report from the trip. The jewelry for promotional gifting was a particularly nice touch. I'm sure he appreciated the detail." The color drained completely from his face. He finally understood. I hadn't just discovered his affair. I had systematically dismantled his entire world while he was sipping cocktails by the pool. "He's expecting you in his office at 9 a.m. tomorrow," I said, walking toward the staircase. "I wouldn't be late." He just sat there, a statue carved from ruin, the photograph of his betrayal lying on the table in front of him. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, turning to look at him one last time. He wasn't my husband anymore. He was just a bad investment. "To bed," I said, "in the guest room. I've already moved your things into the garage. I suggest you find a hotel. It seems you're quite proficient at it." I left him there, alone in the silent house with nothing but the echoes of his collapsed empire for company. The war wasn't over, but the decisive battle had just been won. Mark's meeting with David Sterling was not a negotiation. It was a tribunal. I wasn't there, of course. My presence wasn't necessary. I had already presented the evidence and delivered the opening and closing statements. I was merely the architect of a demolition. And on that Monday morning, David Sterling was the foreman swinging the wrecking ball. I imagined Mark walking into that boardroom, a man stripped of all his usual defenses. His charisma, his glib excuses, his carefully constructed persona, they were all useless against the cold, hard data of his fraud. He was no longer a star creative director, he was a liability, and in David Sterling's world, liabilities were not managed. They were liquidated. I spent the morning not in a state of anxious anticipation, but in quiet, methodical preparation. I was at my lawyer's office, a sleek, minimalist space that felt like the antithesis of my cluttered, emotionally complicated home. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Catherine, reviewed the documents I had brought. She wasn't interested in the emotional narrative of the affair. She was a strategist, and she saw the situation for what it was: a breach of contract, both marital and professional. She looked up from the printouts of Alex's files and the fraudulent expense reports, a thin, appreciative smile on her face. "This is," she said, tapping the stack of papers, "extraordinarily thorough. You've done most of my job for me." His arrogance was his greatest vulnerability, I explained. He documented his own crimes. I just organized the evidence. Catherine nodded, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a clean, decisive victory. "The professional misconduct is our hammer," she explained. We don't lead with the infidelity. That's messy and subjective. We lead with the demonstrable financial and ethical breaches. It gives us leverage that a simple affair never could. He didn't just break your trust, he risked your shared assets and committed fireable offenses. In the eyes of the court, that's the cardinal sin. She was right. I wasn't just the wronged wife, I was the financially compromised partner, a position that commanded far more respect in the world of legal dissolution. The call from Mark came at precisely 10:47 a.m. His number flashed on my screen, and I let it go to voicemail, a small but satisfying assertion of my new control over our lines of communication. Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Let's see what the verdict is," she said. I played the message on speakerphone. Mark's voice was unrecognizable. The smooth, confident baritone was gone, replaced by a ragged, desperate rasp. "Sarah, pick up, please. They fired me. David, he didn't even let me explain. He just had security escort me out. My email is locked, my keycard is deactivated, everything's gone." He wasn't just unemployed, he had been excommunicated. David Sterling hadn't just fired him, he had erased him. In the cutthroat world of advertising, being escorted out by security was a death sentence. It was a public declaration of unforgivable sin. No respectable agency would touch him now. The rumor mill, already primed by Eleanor Vance's discreet inquiries, would be churning at full speed by lunchtime. He would be a pariah before he even had the chance to update his LinkedIn profile. "He's radioactive," Catherine stated, a hint of admiration in her voice. Sterling didn't just neutralize a threat, he made an example of him. The message continued, his voice cracking with a combination of rage and self-pity. "And Chloe, they fired her too. They called her into a separate meeting with HR. She called me crying, said they cited a morality clause and gross misuse of company resources. She blames me. She blames me, Sarah. Can you believe that? After everything?" He still didn't get it. He was so steeped in his own narcissism that he couldn't comprehend that his co-conspirator was facing her own consequences. He expected her loyalty, as the ship they had built together was sinking to the bottom of the ocean.
But it was the final part of his message that was the most telling. And the house, Sarah, David's lawyers are talking about clawbacks. They're auditing my bonuses for the last 3 years, for all the campaigns, for Alex's campaigns. They're saying I have to pay it back. They're threatening to sue. We could lose everything. We. The word hung in the air of my lawyer's office, a phantom limb of a marriage that no longer existed. He was still clinging to the idea of a we, a shared fate, a shared financial burden. He still saw me as his partner, the one who would fix his messes and balance his books. Catherine leaned back in her chair, a look of profound satisfaction on her face. "And there it is," she said, "the checkmate. He's not just broke, he's in debt to the company he defrauded. He has no income, no reputation, and a mountain of legal and financial problems." She looked at me. "Which means he has absolutely no leverage in the divorce. We don't have to negotiate. We dictate the terms." I felt a wave of cold, clean clarity wash over me. This was the moment I had been working toward since I first saw that blurry photograph. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about balancing the books on 15 years of a fraudulent partnership. I picked up my phone and began to type a text message to Mark, my first direct communication with him since he'd walked into his tribunal. The message was simple, concise, and utterly final. My text message to Mark was not an olive branch, it was a summons. "Catherine's office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Be there." There was no, "I'm sorry this happened to you," no, "we need to talk." It was the cold, impersonal language of a legal proceeding, a clear signal that the personal relationship was over, and the business of dissolution had begun. He was no longer my husband. He was the opposing party in a settlement negotiation. And he was arriving at the table with no assets and no bargaining chips. He was a king who had been deposed, now being called to witness the redrawing of his former kingdom's maps. He arrived looking like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was pale, and the confident swagger that had defined him was gone, replaced by the shuffling, hesitant gait of a man bracing for another blow. He sat opposite me at the long, polished mahogany table in Catherine's conference room, a chasm of legal and emotional distance between us. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, bewildered plea. He was searching for the woman who had managed his life for 15 years, the one who would find a way to fix this. That woman was no longer in the room. Catherine began, her voice crisp and businesslike. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Mark, we've reviewed your financial situation in light of your termination from Elo Banana. The company's intention to claw back 3 years of bonuses based on campaigns now under review for intellectual property theft has rendered your primary asset, your projected future income, a significant liability. She let the words sink in. He was not just at zero, he was in the negative. Given this, Sarah is prepared to offer you a one-time settlement to expedite the divorce and allow both parties to move forward.
Mark looked at me, completely ignoring Catherine. "Sarah, please," he whispered. "Don't do this. We can fight them. The ideas were collaborations. They can't prove—" He was still trying to sell a narrative, to create a fiction he could live in. "It's over, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The time for stories is over. Catherine has the terms." The look in his eyes shifted from desperation to a dawning horror. He was finally beginning to understand that I was not his ally in this fight. I was the architect of his defeat. Catherine slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was not a complex legal document. It was a simple, brutal list of demands, a list that represented the final balancing of our 15-year ledger. The terms are straightforward. Sarah will assume full ownership of the house and all its contents. In return, she will also assume the full liability of the remaining mortgage. You will vacate the premises within 48 hours. Mark's mouth fell open. The house was his castle, the ultimate symbol of his success, the stage on which he performed his life. "You can't," he stammered. "My name is on the deed. Half of that is mine." "Half of the equity in that house was built with bonuses from fraudulent campaigns," Catherine countered, her voice like ice. "Bonuses the agency is now demanding be returned. If you were to fight for your half, you would also be fighting for your half of that debt, a debt that far exceeds the value of the equity. Sarah is, quite generously, offering to take on that entire financial burden herself. It was a brilliant move, framing my acquisition of our greatest asset as a magnanimous sacrifice. He wasn't just losing the house, he was being told he should be grateful for it." The list continued. "You will waive any and all claims to Sarah's private investment portfolio and retirement accounts. These were managed solely by her and funded by her own financial strategies separate from your income." This was the kill shot. His entire sense of self was tied to the belief that he was the breadwinner, the provider. The reality, which I had shielded him from for years, was that my quiet, diligent investing had built the real, stable foundation of our wealth. His income, propped up by stolen ideas, was a volatile, illegitimate stream that had now run dry. He had been living in a house I paid for, built on a career others had designed. Finally, Catherine delivered the coup de grace. "In exchange for your full and immediate cooperation," she concluded, "Sarah will not pursue any further civil action against you for the misappropriation of shared funds used to finance your extramarital affair, as documented in your corporate expense reports. Consider it severance." The room was silent. I had taken everything, his home, his wealth, his future security, and framed it as a deal. He was being offered a chance to walk away with nothing, and it was the best offer he was ever going to get. He had entered the room hoping for a negotiation. He was being presented with terms of unconditional surrender.
The man who could sell anything had finally been presented with a deal he had no choice but to accept. The only thing left to sell was his own signature. Mark signed the papers. There was no theatrical rage, no final, desperate plea. There was only the quiet, scratching sound of a pen signing away a life he had thought was his. He moved through the motions like a ghost, his face pale and slack, the fight completely gone out of him. He had built his world on charisma and deception. And when faced with the cold, hard mechanics of consequences, he simply folded. He was a master of the pitch, but he had no strategy for the end game. As he pushed the signed document back across the table, he looked not at me, but at some distant point over my shoulder, as if he were already seeing the bleak, empty future that awaited him. His departure from the house was just as spectral. I stayed at a hotel for the 2 days I had given him, wanting no part in the pathetic spectacle of his exile. Our neighbor, a kind, retired woman named Mrs. Gable, gave me the play-by-play. She described a single, battered, moving truck arriving in the dead of night, Mark and one other man, no friends, no family, loading a few boxes and a single mattress into the back. He didn't take the designer furniture I had picked out or the art we had collected. He took only his clothes and a few personal effects, the meager possessions of a man who had discovered, too late, that he owned nothing of real value. He was leaving not just a house, but a life he had only been renting. I returned to a home that felt both familiar and utterly transformed. The physical space was the same, but the oppressive weight of his presence, the constant low-level hum of his ego, was gone. The silence was profound. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a clean one, a blank slate. I walked through the rooms, touching the surfaces of things that were now unequivocally mine. The mahogany desk in his former office, the leather sofa in the living room, the Viking range in the kitchen. They were no longer props in the theater of our marriage. They were simply my possessions. The feeling was not one of triumph, but of a quiet, profound relief. The feeling of a long and painful fever finally breaking. The fallout from his professional life continued to ripple through the city's social fabric. Eleanor Vance, having successfully positioned herself as the oracle who saw it all coming, made sure the story had legs. She told everyone with a dramatic flair how I had come to her, a brave wife grappling with a difficult truth, and how she had counseled me. She painted herself as my confidant and protector, a narrative I allowed to flourish because it served my purpose. Mark wasn't just a cheat and a fraud. He was now the subject of a cautionary tale, a social pariah, whose name was spoken only in whispers at the country club. His social execution was as swift and total as his professional one.
A week after he left, I received a certified letter. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. My first thought was that Mark, in a final act of deluded desperation, was trying to contest the settlement. But the letter wasn't from him. It was from Chloe Vance. Her lawyers informed me that she intended to sue Mark for professional damages and emotional distress, claiming he had created a hostile work environment and sabotaged her career through his manipulative and predatory behavior. She was reinventing herself, shifting from co-conspirator to victim, and she was using the very language of corporate accountability to do it. The irony was exquisite. She had learned Mark's lessons well. When one narrative fails, simply create a new one. I sat in my quiet, empty office, the letter in my hand, and felt a strange sense of detachment. Chloe's lawsuit, Mark's ruin, Eleanor's gossip, it all felt like a story about other people. I had been the catalyst, the one who lit the match, but the fire was now burning on its own, fueled by the very ambitions and deceptions of the people it was consuming. They were trapped in a feedback loop of their own making, a snake eating its own tail. My only role now was to be a spectator. I had balanced the books, settled the accounts, and walked away from the wreckage. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I poured myself a glass of wine, put a jazz record on the turntable, and sat in the living room with no laptop, no spreadsheets,
No purpose other than to simply be in the space. The house was mine. My future was mine. The quiet was mine. But as the sun set, casting long, melancholic shadows across the floor, a new, unsettling feeling began to creep in. I had won. I had achieved a cold, clean, and total victory. So why did my meticulously reclaimed life suddenly feel so profoundly, terrifyingly empty? The war was over, but I was now the sole occupant of the battlefield, and I had no idea what came next.
The emptiness was a physical presence, a house guest who had overstayed its welcome. In the first few weeks, I had mistaken it for peace, the blessed silence after a storm. But as the days bled into one another, the silence began to feel less like peace and more like a vacuum. I had spent 15 years managing a crisis, the slow, simmering crisis of Mark's ego and my own denial. My days had been structured around his needs, my thoughts occupied by the logistics of his life. Now, with the crisis resolved and the manager's job eliminated, I was left with a chilling, unstructured freedom. I had won the war, but I had forgotten to plan for the peace. My life, which had once felt like a complex, high-stakes chess match, now felt like a solved puzzle. All the pieces were in their correct places, the picture was complete, but the game was over. I found myself wandering through my own house like a tourist, admiring the clean lines and the uncluttered surfaces, but feeling no real connection to them.
I had secured the assets, but I had lost the purpose. I had spent so long defining myself in opposition to Mark as his partner, his manager, his eventual destroyer, that I'd forgotten who I was without him as a reference point. The victory felt hollow, a perfectly executed strategy with no emotional payoff. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I found myself in his former office, the room I had mentally reclaimed as my own. I was sorting through the last vestiges of his professional life, old industry magazines, outdated tech gadgets, the detritus of a career built on air. In the back of a filing cabinet, tucked away in a mislabeled folder, I found something I didn't expect, a small, leather-bound portfolio. It wasn't his. The initials embossed on the cover were not MF. They were SR, Sarah Reynolds, my maiden name. I hadn't seen it in 15 years. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were not financial documents or investment plans, but pages of my own creative work, designs and concepts from before I had met Mark. There were sketches for a boutique hotel, a branding guide for a nonprofit I'd volunteered for, a complete hand-drawn advertising campaign for a local winery. The work was good, more than good. It was alive. It was filled with a passion and a creative spark that I hadn't felt in a decade and a half. I had been a designer once, a creative in my own right, with a promising future at a small, up-and-coming agency. I had given it all up when I married Mark, convinced that my talent was in management, in supporting his once-in-a-generation genius. The lie I had uncovered was not just his, it was mine as well. I hadn't just been his partner, I had been his first and most thoroughly plundered resource. He hadn't just stolen ideas from Alex and Chloe. He had, in a much quieter and more insidious way, absorbed my own creative life force. He had seen the talent in me, the strategic mind, the creative spark, and he had redirected it, channeled it into the service of his own ambition. The Mark tax hadn't started with his junior employees. It had started with his wife. I was patient zero. The discovery didn't feel like a new betrayal. It felt like a diagnosis. It explained the emptiness, the sense of a life that was perfectly ordered, but fundamentally vacant. I had spent 15 years balancing someone else's books, but I had left my own completely unattended.
I had meticulously managed our financial portfolio while allowing my own creative and emotional portfolio to lie dormant, gathering dust in the back of a forgotten cabinet. The house, the money, the social victory, it was all just compensation for a theft that was far more profound than I had ever realized. He hadn't just taken my trust, he had taken my trajectory. I sat on the floor of my office, the old portfolio spread out before me, the forgotten language of my own talent staring back at me. The feeling that washed over me was not anger at him, but a deep, aching grief for the woman that I had been, the woman I had traded for a life of quiet, competent management.
The silence in the house no longer felt like a void. It felt like an accusation. I had emptied my life of him, but I had not yet figured out how to fill it with myself. The demolition was complete, the site was cleared, but I was standing in the middle of the rubble with no blueprints for what to build next. The portfolio was not a relic. It was a map leading back to a version of myself I had buried alive 15 years ago. For 2 days, I did nothing but study it, not with nostalgia, but with the cold, analytical eye of an auditor. I wasn't mourning the past. I was assessing a dormant asset. The designs were raw, the ideas unpolished, but the core of it, the strategic thinking, the understanding of narrative, was all there. The woman who created this work wasn't just an artist. She was a strategist. And as I stared at her work, a new, audacious thought began to form. Not a whisper of hope, but the clear, concise language of a business plan. The first step was to get a current valuation. I needed to know if this old currency still had any value in the modern market. There was only one person who could give me an honest appraisal, a man I hadn't spoken to since my wedding day, Julian Croft. He had been my first boss, my mentor, the owner of the small, fiercely creative agency where I had started my career. He had been furious when I'd left to marry Mark, telling me I was trading a real future for a supporting role. At the time, I had dismissed it as jealousy. Now I understood it as prophecy. Making the call was one of the hardest things I had ever done. My hand hovered over the phone, my mind racing with a dozen scenarios of rejection and pity. I was no longer the promising young designer he had known. I was Sarah Flores, the ex-wife of a disgraced industry pariah. When his assistant put me through, his voice was wary, professional. "Sarah, this is a surprise." I didn't waste time on apologies or long-winded explanations. I treated it like a pitch. "Julian, I need 30 minutes of your time. I'm not looking for a job. I'm looking for a professional assessment of a dormant creative portfolio. Mine." The silence on his end was long and heavy. I could picture him in his sunlit office, surrounded by the awards and accolades he had earned, the ones Mark had only pretended to have. "My office, tomorrow at 4, he said finally, and hung up. I walked into his agency the next day feeling like a fraud, the very thing I had come to despise. His world was vibrant, alive with the chaotic energy of real creation. It was the complete opposite of the sterile corporate silence of Ello Banana. Julian looked older, grayer, but his eyes were as sharp as I remembered. He didn't offer sympathy or ask about Mark. He simply gestured to the conference table. "Let's see it." I laid out the old portfolio, my hands steady despite the frantic beating of my heart. He flipped through the pages in silence, his expression unreadable. Each passing second felt like a judgment. He spent a long time on the winery campaign, tilting the page to the light, studying the hand-lettered typography. "I remember this," he said quietly. "You had a real fire in you, Sarah. You saw the whole board, not just the next move. Then you married that showman, and it all just stopped." He closed the portfolio and looked at me, his gaze intense. "This is good work, for its time, but the industry has changed in 15 years. The tools are different, the language is different. A portfolio from the past isn't enough." It was the cold, professional truth I had expected, and yet it still stung. "I know," I said, my voice even, "but I haven't just been idle for 15 years. I've been in a different kind of school.
I then spent 10 minutes outlining not the story of my marriage, but the skill set I had acquired. I talked about managing multi-million-dollar portfolios, about negotiating with contractors and vendors, about crisis management and damage control. I described, in the detached language of a consultant, how I had identified a systemic fraud and systematically dismantled the career of the man responsible. I was pitching myself not as the artist I had been, but as the strategist I had become. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. It wasn't a smile of pity, it was a smile of recognition. "So, the fire didn't go out," he said, a newfound respect in his voice. "It just got channeled into burning down the prison." He leaned back in his chair. "All right, Sarah Reynolds, you want an assessment. Here it is. Your creative instincts are 15 years out of date, but your strategic mind is razor-sharp and battle-hardened. The question is, can the two still work together?" He slid a thin folder across the table. "The City Arts Council. Pro bono. They need a complete rebranding campaign for their fall fundraising drive. They have no money, no clear message, and the attention span of the city is 0. It's an impossible brief. It wasn't a job offer, it was a challenge, a test. He was giving me a chance to prove that the designer and the strategist could coexist in the same body. He said, "I want a full concept deck, strategy, creative, execution plan. You have 1 week." As I stood to leave, the folder in my hand, I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a decade and a half: purpose. This wasn't about reclaiming the past or getting back what I had lost. It was about integrating the two halves of my life, the creative girl I had been and the ruthless operator I had been forced to become. I had the blueprint for Mark's destruction. Now, for the first time, I was holding the blueprint for my own reconstruction. The week that followed was a blur of caffeine, sleepless nights, and the exhilarating, terrifying hum of a creative mind roaring back to life. The City Arts Council project was not just an assignment, it was an exorcism. I converted his old office, the sterile monument to his fraudulent career, into my war room. The walls, once bare, were now covered in sketches, market research, and scribbled taglines.
The silence of the house was no longer a void. It was filled with the sounds of my own process: the scratching of a pencil, the clicking of a mouse, the low murmur of me talking through ideas to an empty room. I was not just building a campaign, I was rebuilding a part of myself I had thought was lost forever. The impossible brief was a gift. The lack of resources forced me to be innovative. The lack of a clear message forced me to dig deep to find the one true story the Arts Council needed to tell. I spent hours walking through the city, not as Sarah Flores, the country club wife, but as Sarah Reynolds, the designer. I saw the city with new eyes, noticing the murals on alley walls, the struggling musicians in the park, the small, independent galleries fighting to stay afloat. The problem wasn't that the city didn't have art. It was that the art was invisible, disconnected from the very people it was meant to serve. The campaign couldn't be about asking for money. It had to be about forging a connection. My strategist's mind took over. This wasn't a branding problem. It was a logistics and distribution problem. The art was trapped in galleries and theaters, accessible only to those who already knew where to look. My creative mind found the solution. The campaign I designed was called Art Unboxed. The concept was simple. For 1 month, we would take the art out of the galleries and put it into the daily lives of the city's residents. We would partner with local businesses, coffee shops, laundromats, bus stations, to install temporary small-scale art exhibits. A sculpture next to the sugar packets, a poem printed on a dry cleaning bag, a short film playing on the screens at the gas pump. The fundraising element wasn't a plea, it was an invitation to keep the art unboxed. I worked with a fury I hadn't felt since my 20s, the two halves of my brain, the creative and the logistical, finally firing in perfect sync. I designed the logo, wrote the copy, and built a multi-phase media strategy that relied on guerrilla marketing and social media, the only tools a non-existent budget could afford. By the end of the week, I had a 60-page presentation deck that was the most authentic, powerful thing I had ever created. It was the culmination of everything I was, the young idealist who sketched in notebooks and the hardened realist who balanced ledgers. It was my past and my present, integrated into a single, compelling vision for the future. I walked into Julian's office exactly 1 week later, not as a supplicant, but as a peer. I didn't present the campaign to him. I pitched it to him the same way I would to a client. I laid out the strategy, the creative, the budget, or lack thereof, and the projected metrics for success. I spoke with a passion and authority that came from a place of deep, unshakable ownership. This wasn't an idea I had borrowed or managed. This was an idea I had bled for. When I finished, the conference room was silent. Julian was leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Alex Smith, whom Julian had invited to sit in, was staring at the presentation screen, his mouth slightly open.
Julian didn't speak for a full minute. He simply stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. "When you came in here last week," he said, his back still to me, "I thought I was doing a favor for the ghost of a talented kid I used to know. I gave you an impossible, thankless project, half hoping you'd walk away, half curious to see how you'd fail." He turned around, and for the first time I saw not a mentor or a judge, but a colleague. "You didn't just solve the brief, Sarah. You redefined the problem. You didn't design an ad campaign. You designed a civic movement." He walked back to the table and slid the presentation deck back toward me. "This is too good to be a pro bono project." My heart sank. I had misunderstood. This was his polite way of saying no. "It's too good," he continued, "to be managed by my agency. It needs to be managed by its creator." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. "I'm not going to offer you a job, Sarah. I'm going to offer you a partnership. I'll provide the seed funding, the back-end support, and the office space. You will launch your own independent creative consultancy specializing in community-focused and non-profit branding. This Arts Council campaign will be your first client. And Alex here," he said, gesturing to the stunned young designer, "will be your first employee, if he's smart enough to accept." I stared at him, the words not fully registering. A partnership. My own consultancy. This wasn't just a second chance, it was a better chance, a future I had never even been audacious enough to dream of. I had walked into this process seeking validation, a simple confirmation that I still had some value. I was walking out with an empire of my own, built not on the ruins of my past, but on the integrated strength of every part of my life. I looked at Alex, who was now grinning from ear to ear, and then back at Julian. There was only one word to say. The first word of the rest of my life. Yes. 6 months later, Art Unboxed was not just a campaign, it was the talk of the town. The city had embraced it with a fierce, protective pride. People went on scavenger hunts to find the latest unboxed piece, and local news ran feel-good stories about the laundromat that had become an unlikely poetry hub. And corporate sponsors, seeing the immense positive PR, were suddenly lining up to fund the next phase. My new consultancy, which I had named Reynolds & Co., was a runaway success before we had even had a chance to print business cards. Alex, free from the oppressive shadow of Mark's mentorship, was producing the most brilliant work of his life. We were a small, agile 2-person team, and we were running circles around the big, lumbering agencies, including the one now being run by Robert Vance. The satisfaction I felt was a world away from the cold, hollow victory of my divorce. This was not about tearing something down, it was about building something up. Every success, every positive headline, every email from a citizen who had been touched by the campaign felt like a validation of a part of myself I had long thought dead. I was working harder than I ever had in my life, but for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't exhausted. I was energized. I was no longer managing a fraudulent asset, I was cultivating a genuine one. The encounter happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was on my way to a meeting, cutting through the city's central plaza. when I saw him. Mark. I almost didn't recognize him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by worn jeans and a faded, ill-fitting polo shirt. The confident, charismatic stride had been replaced by a weary, aimless shuffle. He was standing in front of a small, pop-up coffee kiosk, counting out change to pay for a simple black coffee. He looked diminished. The larger-than-life persona had collapsed, leaving behind only a tired, middle-aged man. He didn't see me at first. I could have just walked away, left him to his quiet anonymity. But some impulse, a mixture of morbid curiosity and a strange, detached pity, made me stop. I walked up to the kiosk, my heels clicking on the pavement, a sound that made him look up. His eyes widened in shock, a flicker of the old panic returning. He was looking at my tailored blazer, my leather briefcase, the confident set of my shoulders. He was looking at a woman he had never known, a woman who had been created in the vacuum of his departure. "Sarah," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Hello, Mark," I replied, my tone neutral, polite. It was the voice I would use for a stranger. "How are you?" The question was a formality, but his answer was a raw, unfiltered confession. "I'm working," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a nearby office building. "Inbound sales. For a software company. It's a job." Inbound sales. He, the master of the pitch, the charismatic rainmaker, was now answering phones, a faceless voice at the bottom of the corporate food chain. The humiliation was written all over his face. He looked around the plaza, at the banners and posters for Art Unboxed. My logo, a clean, elegant R & Co., on every one of them. "I see your stuff everywhere," he said, a note of bitter awe in his voice. "It's good. Really good. You had the eye." It was the closest he would ever come to an admission, a confession of the talent he had seen in me, and suppressed for his own gain. "Yes," I said, simply. "I did."
He took a sip of his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "I heard Chloe is suing me," he said, a desperate attempt to find some common ground, to cast us as fellow victims of her ambition. I refused to take the bait. "That's between you and her," I said, my voice cool. "It has nothing to do with me." The finality in my tone seemed to crush him. He finally understood that I was not a part of his story anymore. I was not his ally, his enemy, or his ex-wife. I was just a successful businesswoman passing him on the street. "I miss the house," he said quietly, his eyes fixated on the ground. It was a pathetic, last-ditch attempt to evoke a shared memory, a flicker of nostalgia. But the house he was remembering was a stage set, a fiction we had both propped up. "It's just a house, Mark," I said, my voice not unkind, but firm. "You build a new one. That's what people do." I gave him a small, polite nod, the kind one gives an acquaintance before moving on. "I have to get to a meeting. Goodbye." I turned and walked away, not looking back. I didn't feel triumph or pity or anger. I felt nothing at all. He was a ghost from a past life, a bad investment I had fully divested from. My portfolio was now diversified, my future was hedged, and I was on my way to a meeting to discuss my next acquisition, my own happiness. The meeting was not in a sterile boardroom, but in the sun-drenched corner office of Reynolds & Co., a space that overlooked the very plaza where I had just left the ghost of my past. My new office was everything Mark's had not been. Open, collaborative, filled with light and the chaotic energy of genuine creation. Alex was at the whiteboard, sketching out a new concept, his face alight with the kind of passion that can't be feigned. Julian was on the speakerphone, laughing about a new, ridiculously wealthy client who wanted us to rebrand his entire corporate foundation. This was not a company. It was a community,
a small ecosystem of talent and respect that we were building from the ground up. As I sat down, slipping off my blazer and rolling up my sleeves, I looked around the room. This was the real asset. Not the house, not the investment portfolio, but this, the feeling of purpose, the thrill of building something from nothing, the quiet, profound satisfaction of seeing an idea come to life. The cold, hollow victory of my divorce had been replaced by the warm, vibrant reality of my new life. I had not just reclaimed my independence. I had discovered that my true net worth had nothing to do with numbers on a balance sheet. After the meeting, Alex turned to me, his expression serious. "He got a call last week," he said, his voice hesitant, "from a recruiter for a senior designer position at Ello Banana." My heart gave a small, unexpected jolt. Ello Banana was in trouble.
After Mark's implosion and Robert Vance's subsequent takeover, the agency had lost its creative spark. They were losing clients, bleeding talent, a slow-motion collapse under the weight of uninspired, committee-driven work. "They're trying to poach my best designer?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, a playful challenge in my voice. Alex laughed, shaking his head. "No way. I told them I wasn't interested. What we have here, this is real. That place," he trailed off, a shadow of the old fear in his eyes. "That place is a tomb." He was right. Ello Banana had become a monument to the very thing we were fighting against. The idea that creativity could be manufactured, that talent could be managed like a commodity, that a brand was more important than the people who built it. "Besides," he added, a grin spreading across his face, "I hear the new creative director is a nightmare. Some guy from Chicago who thinks innovation is changing the font on the logo." We both laughed, a shared, easy camaraderie that was the bedrock of our partnership. In that moment, the final lingering threads of my past finally, irrevocably snapped. Mark, Chloe, Ello Banana, they were no longer players in my story. They were cautionary tales, footnotes in the history of a city whose creative soul we were now helping to reignite. They had been obsessed with the architecture of success, the titles, the awards, the corner offices. We were focused on the foundation, the work, the integrity, the people. Later that evening, I walked home through the city streets, the art unboxed banners fluttering in the autumn breeze. I passed the coffee kiosk where I had seen Mark, but my mind was not on him. My mind was on the pitch for the next day, on a new idea for a literacy program, on the infinite, exciting possibilities that stretched out before me. I arrived at my house, my quiet, peaceful, beautifully empty house, and I did something I hadn't done since I had reclaimed it. I walked into my office, pulled out my old leather-bound portfolio, and opened it to a blank page. I picked up a pencil, the graphite smooth and cool against my fingers, and in the quiet, contented silence of my own life, I began to sketch. I was no longer a wife, a manager, or a victim. I was not the architect of someone else's ruin. I was, finally, simply the designer of my own life. And the work was just beginning.